Beverly Hills Baptist at 4:30. I don't know about you, but that's early for me. And it was even earlier than that because Peanut had a scrimmage game the night before. So by the time I had to wait for him, he spent the night with some friends because I had to leave so early in the morning. And I set my alarm, and my alarm said, when it was getting ready to go off, when I turned the light off, it said, you have 3 hours and 45 minutes before your alarm goes off. And so I was supposed to drive. And it's, 200 miles up to Grafton. And we get there at the church, and my nephew, Luke Creasy, Greg Creasy's son, is a no-show. And we were already short. We had 2 people cancel because they got sick. The previous time we played, we had 16 people. We had 9 scheduled to go. We were down to 8. And Luke didn't show. We're like, we got to leave. We got 7 people. We're going to have to pick up at least 2, maybe 3 guys to the inmates to play with us. Which we've done that before, but that's not fun for them because, why? We're going to play against our own guys. They do that all the time. They want to play against some fresh blood, which is us. The Sharks are out there and they're looking for us. And so we get on the road. We've called Luke. We've texted Luke. And then finally Luke calls, 5:30. Hey, I'm sorry. My alarm didn't go off. I didn't wake up. We met him in Elkview. We waited. We stopped at the Elkview McDonald's and had our breakfast and waited on him to catch up with us and drove up there. So we had 8 people. So we had to pick up 2 people off their team. We played our first game at 9 o'clock in the morning, picked up 2 of their guys, and played. And unfortunately, this prison's a little different. They're all dressed in what I would call janitorial type clothing, almost like one-piece clothing. And they come down and they change in their gym, and they come out in their shorts and their white t-shirts. A lot of the prisons we play in, they have their own uniforms, They're pretty ready for this. So these guys come down, cross the street, we go over there, we get ready to play, and there's like 8 people maybe sitting in the stands. They don't let the people come down. There's like 300 or 400 people in the prison. So they don't let them all come down. They only let the people that's playing softball, which I don't like that. But God's got a plan, right? I'm like, let us witness to the whole, that's why we want to be there, to witness to as many people as we can. But that didn't happen. So we had our morning session. We played 1 game, a 7-inning game. They had their lunch scheduled, so we had to break away. We went out to a community park and had breakfast, or had lunch rather, and then we came back and we played 2 more games with them in the same scenario. There's like 4 guys that was there in the morning that came back and played again in the afternoon. Played against us this time. We had 2 that played for us. They played against us the next time. And so we go in there and we played 3 games. And lo and behold, we won 3 games. I don't think we've ever won 3 games in a day. And we did. And even being short. Now, granted, the caliber of play wasn't as good as we played in some of the other prisons, but we were missing 8 guys. 8 guys that would have started on our team wasn't there. So we played kind of short too. So everything worked out. And here's the results. We had about, I'd say, between 35 and 40 people there total. We had 5 guys make a first-time commitment to accept Jesus as Lord and Savior. We had 9 guys say they were going to consider it. We had 21 guys say we're going to rededicate our lives. So even with that small percentage of people that were there, that's a huge percentage of responses that we got. So God had a plan. Just like your prayer this morning, as tragic as our world seems to be in, chaotic all over the world, quite frankly, God knows everything. We're going to find out in our lesson today, everything's been predestined from the beginning of time. We are limited by time by virtue as, we got to pull our calendar out and check what we're doing next month or 2 months from now or 6 months from now. God knows everything that's going to happen 6 years from now, just like it's happening right now, just like it happened 6 years before. He's not limited by time. And we're going to find out in our lesson today, there's no limit by time with God, right? And there's no limit but with Jesus. So let's look at this. This is going to be my sermon title today, and I'm going to call it The Trials and the Cross. And I was sitting there looking over something this morning, and I thought, maybe I should have titled it Test, Not Trust. because we're going to find those two words come applicable today too. Testing and not trusting. So let's look at the first part. Let's go over here to verse 1, chapter 23, and it says this. Then the whole body of them arose, and they brought him before Pilate. Now, if you remember, Pilate's our perfect governor. Perfect's what they call the governor, not meaning that he was perfect as a person, because he was horrible as a person. They didn't like Pilate. Let's look down here at the next verse. And they began to accuse him, saying, we found this man misleading our nation and forbidding us to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ the King. Well, if you remember, let's back up into the last chapter. What was Jesus accused of? This says he's accused of three things. Misleading our nation. He's trying to be a rebel. He's going to start a riot. He's going to try to break those Jews off away from Rome. He's trying to start a riot. And then it says, in addition to that, he's forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar. Well, if we remember correctly, last chapter it says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Render unto God what's God. He wasn't doing that. False accusation again. And then it says, he set himself up to be king. He's not setting himself up to be king. He didn't say that. He wasn't trying to set himself up to be king. He came as a servant. I came to serve. So what happened in the last chapter? What was he accused of? Blasphemy. What was blasphemy? The blasphemy was he said, I am who you say I am. You said, well, you're saying you're God. That's blasphemy. Well, why didn't they say that to Pilate? Who did Pilate represent? He represented Rome. How many gods, little g's, did they have in Rome? Like hundreds. You're like, so what? So he says he's a god. We worship 100 gods. We don't know which one he worships. Who cares? So they've accused him of three things here. Three things that would tie them back to the Roman authority that they would have to acknowledge. Now, if you remember, the Jews did not have the authority to persecute him criminally and crucify him and to murder him. They had to go to Rome to do that. And that's why they got in Pilate. And why is Pilate even here in the first place? What's going on this week?
Passover.
It's Passover. And this is why they got Pilate's in, and we're going to find out that another guy that's in town happens to be Herod Antipas. He's in town. And why is he in town? Because of Passover. And they're both in town because they know that the Jews are congregating in a huge mass, because that's what they do on Passover. They congregate at Jerusalem. And so they're there to try to keep the peace, make sure everything's good, because if you remember, who's the big boss in Rome?
Caesar.
Which one? He has a little right here. He has a little town named after him right here. Tiberius. Tiberius was the head honcho, the Caesar at the time, and they don't want Tiberius to get mad because they have to answer to him. And quite frankly, from what the commentators say, Tiberius didn't really like Pontius Pilate. He kind of married into the family. So they said, well, here, we'll give you a job. Go over here to Judah, and you can be the governor over there. If you remember, that used to belong to another Herod, Archelaus, right? He's gone. He's out of the picture right now. The new guy in town is the new governor. They didn't give him a kingdom because they didn't like him that well. They didn't say, you're going to have kingdom authority over here. We'll give you the name of perfect governor. And that's who Pontius Pilate is. And so we're going to find out a little bit of history about him as we go along. So let's go down here to verse 3. And it says this, and Pilate asked him, saying, are you the king of the Jews? And here's the interesting thing, because Jesus didn't always answer this question, but he answers it right here. He says, and he answered him, he says, it is as you say. It is as you say. So he's saying, I am the king of the Jews. Right? So how does Pilate respond? He says this. Pilate says in verse 4, he said to the chief priests and the multitudes, I find no fault in this man. Wait a minute. He just said he was the king of the Jews. You asked him a question, and after his interrogation, we found out last week when Paul was when Peter was being interrogated by the little Girl Scout, remember? He folded and he said, I don't know this Jesus. And now Jesus is saying, I am who you say I am. And then Pilate says, I find no fault in this guy. Here's an interesting twist we're going to uncover as we go along. Peter denied Jesus how many times?
3.
Guess how many times Pilate says that Jesus is innocent? 3. So, now check this out. If you're in court, anybody ever been in a small claims court? Because like a magistrate court or something like that. I know you've been in big court, but in big court. But some people go to small courts because we're not as privileged to do big damages as like you guys have witnessed. But you run a traffic light, you get a speeding ticket, and you're like, I really wasn't speeding, and the cop gives you a speeding ticket. You got to go to court to dispute it. And if the judge says to the officer there, I find no fault in this guy, what are you going to do? You're going to go, yeah, I'm out of here. And you're jetted out of there as quickly as you can go. You don't want to have to argue about it because you don't want to pay the ticket. You don't want to pay the court costs. You're just leaving. Well, Jesus is told, I find no fault in you. Why is he not just leaving? Let's go over here. Verse 5. But they kept on insisting, saying, they, being the multitude, is trying to persecute Jesus, right? The chief priests and Sadducees, saying, he stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee. Bingo. Even as far as this place. Well, Galilee, remember? Galilee's up here. And he says, oh, wait a minute. We're down here. We're in Judah. Guess what? He's out of my jurisdiction. I don't even have to respond to him. This guy, I have to go to the guy who is in charge in Galilee. Guess who's in charge in Galilee? Herod. Let's find out what we find here. Verse 7. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself was also in Jerusalem at the time. And again, he was in Jerusalem for the Passover. Now, what do we know about Herod? This is Herod Antipas, okay? One of Herod the Great's sons. And Herod Antipas married his brother's sister. Now, there's two points that I've read, and I first followed the first one, and now I'm a little confused. The first one said he married Herod Archelaus' wife. And the next commentator I said he married Philip's wife. Both of them were sons of Herod the Great. He married the wife, which meant that the daughter was his niece, right? And this lady's name was Herodess. And that's why John the Baptist said, you can't do that. You can't marry your brother's sister or your brother's wife. You can't do that. And that's why Herodias, I said Herodias, I mispronounced. Herodias said, that's why she was always out to get him. And what happened with Herodias and Antipas? They had a little party, right? And during that party, they already had John the Baptist as a prisoner. And that's when she had asked her daughter, hey, why don't you dance a little bit? And then, we'll ask for her, see if he gives you a favor. And the favor was, hey, I'd like to have John the Baptist's head on a silver platter. Who does that? So anyway. She did that. Verse 8. Now Herod was very glad when he saw Jesus, for he had wanted to see him for a long time, because he had been hearing about him, and he was hoping to see him, see some signs performed by him. So he's really wanting a magic trick. He already knew that, hey, I've cut off John the Baptist's head. I know he's dead. I've heard rumors of this guy out here. I've been wanting to beat him for a long time, but I've never been able to run into him. And I'd like to see if he's who he says he is, because some people says he's John the Baptist, he's reincarnated. And I doubt that's the case, because I remember seeing his head on a silver platter. So who is this Jesus? See what he can do for me. And he questioned him at some length, and he answered him nothing. Here he goes. He's probably said, hey, are you the Christ? And what's Jesus say? He answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod, with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. Send him back to Pilate. They're making fun of him here. He's dressed in his robe and so on and so on. Send him back to Pilate and said, now Herod and Pilate became friends with one another that very day, for before they had been enemies with each other. They weren't even cool with one another. But they were cool now because they had something in common. They both got to try Jesus, and neither one of them really wanted to try him, and it broke down a barrier. People that hate each other over Jesus now like each other. You would think people that like Jesus would like each other too, which is what we should do. Let's look at verse 13. Huh? We should love each other. Verse 13. And Pilate summoned the chief priests and the rulers of the people, and he said to them, you brought this man to me as one who incites people to a rebellion, and behold, having examined him before you, I have found no guilt in this man, this is number 2, regarding the charges which you make against him. Nor has Herod, because Herod sent him back to me. He didn't find any guilt in him. Now, I really think the Jews really care what these guys say. They don't like either one of them anyway.
No.
These guys are like, they're the enemy. You're Rome. We don't care whether you say he's innocent or not. We've already made our judgment. We just want you to act it out. No, or has Herod, so he sent him to me, back to us, and behold, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore punish him and release him. Well, wait a minute. You just said he wasn't guilty. How do you punish somebody you just said is not guilty? But he's going to punish him and release him back because he thinks maybe they'll have sympathy. Maybe they'll have sympathy on this guy. We'll beat him up a little bit, toss him around, show him in front of them, and they'll just say, okay, we'll take him back. So verse 17. And now he was obliged to release to them at the feast one prisoner. This was a practice they had during Passover. I have no idea why. But they said that we can release one of our prisoners to you. It's like maybe the president giving some kind of a pardon to somebody, before he goes out of his tenureship, usually some drug smuggler. I'm just joking. I have no idea what they do. And it says here, he says that, verse 18, and they cried out all together, saying, away with this man, and release us to him Barabbas. What? Barabbas. Who is Barabbas? You know what Barabbas stands for, the name Barabbas? Son of the Father. Son of the Father. Barabbas. Barabbas is known as the insurrectionist and the murderer. Let's go here to the next verse. He was one who's been thrown into prison for a certain insurrection and made in the city and for murder. This guy, he should be despised. Barabbas is a bad dude. And Pilate wanted to release Jesus, address them again. But they kept on calling out to him, crucify him, crucify him. And he said to them a third time, why? What evil has this man done? I have found no fault in him, demanding death. All will therefore punish him and release him. But they were insistent, with a loud voice forsaking, that he be crucified, and their voices began to prevail. Can you imagine Pilate? I think I've alluded to this once before to you. We're here at the Antonia Fortress. We're going to get a picture of that here in a second. And the Antonia Fortress is the hearing site, the courtroom, the courthouse, if you will, setting of this showing that you see here in the picture. And off to the side, there's a prison wall, a jail, a cell. And who's in that jail cell? Barabbas. And if Barabbas is in there, he knows he's been accused as being an insurrectionist. He's been accused of being a murderer and inciting all these things. And you hear this chant saying, crucify him, crucify him. What do you think he's thinking? Yeah. They're coming after me. Yeah. They're coming after me. I mean, the crowd's going crazy. I just thought they'd get rid of me. Now this crowd, they're getting like in a riot status. They're coming after me. And Pilate pronounced the sentence that their demand should be granted. In verse 24. And he released the man that they were asking for, who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, but delivered to Jesus to their will. So they're going to turn him over to him. And what's Pilate do? We find this in Matthew. He says, look, I'm going to wash my hands of this guy's guilt. Now, this doesn't mean that Pilate was saved at all. This only says that Pilate says, look, I said he wasn't guilty 3 times. And you all said he is. And I want to turn him over to you. And I'm going to give him to you. And you all do to him what you want to do to him. But I'm done with him. Okay? We find that there. Verse 26. And when they led him away, they laid hold of one called Simon of Cyrene. So here is Cyrene up here at A. And where is this? This is northern Libya or Egypt or past Egypt or Africa, right? The continent of Africa. And this is at the very tip of this. And you're going to go all the way from here to Jerusalem, which is about 900 miles. Simon has come to the Passover, probably hadn't been there before. The commentators didn't allude to whether he was there, or the Bible doesn't say if he's been to previous Passover. But they all are supposed to come to the Passover who are Jews, right? You're supposed to be there once a year. So he's come to this big event. And he's probably saying, you know, I want to see what all this thing's all about. I want to see what Passover is all about. So here we have Simon. Guess what? He might just be blind. Mm-hmm. And guess what cross he's carrying? Jesus. And who's he carrying it for? It's open for everybody, people. Again, it's not just Wayne County. It's everybody. Red, yellow, black, and white. And we got this guy carrying the cross. Now, let's look at this. And verse, it says, he came from the Cyrene, and he placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus. Now, after he was found guilty, he had the cross was typically, according to the commentators, the vertical portion of the cross was already set aside. So probably that morning, the Roman crew said, hey, we got to set up some crosses for the crucifixion. They do this all the time. It wasn't like, you know, this is the first time there's ever been a crucifixion. And it's actually invented in the about 500 BC by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. That's the ones who invented crucifixion. So the Romans have taken it to another level. What they did with it, they put you out on a very popular spot. They put a name on you, and you had to carry your cross to this name tag to the cross. And they would take you around through people so they would see it. And at this major thoroughfare, they would see that sign that would be placed above the cross. So they put this vertical portion in the ground. And they made you carry the crossbeam. The vertical portion and the cross would be like 300 pounds, they said. I don't know. I didn't weigh it. That's what the commentator said. About 300 pounds. And the crossbeam would be somewhere between 50 to 75 pounds. So here you have Simon carrying this crossbar because why? Jesus couldn't carry it. Jesus was a strong man. He was 100% man. He's 100% God. He's probably the strongest man to ever live because he was Jesus. If he wanted to, he could be like Atlas and pick up the whole world and hold it like this, right? Because he has the whole world in his hand. But that's not what it was. He was a carpenter's son. Carpenters are pretty strong. They got to work with wood. They got to pick stuff up. They got to use all their tools. He walked all over the place. I mean, he was walking all over Galilee for 3 years, and he's walking down here, he's walking up here, he's going all the way up to Dan and come back. The guy was in good shape, but he was beaten. He was beaten, he was spit upon, he was mocked, he was slapped, he was hit. All this stuff took its toll on him. And he knew that he was bearing the sins of all mankind. And he also knew that in just a few more years, in 70 AD, this city that he loved was going to be demolished. And everybody in the city that didn't leave, we're going to find out in a minute, was going to be killed. And we also know that he also knows if you don't accept him, you're ultimately going to die. He carried all that stuff to the cross. All that burden was too much for him to handle. And he was falling down carrying this crossbeam. People show the depiction of the whole cross, but the commentators say that's a good depiction, but that's not actual. They carried the crossbeam. So they picked out Simon. Kevin, you get up over here. You carry the crossbeam. You know, they picked this guy out of the crowd, And he had to carry the crossbeam. So he's carrying this thing all the way up here. And it says that, and there were a crowd, and there were following him a great multitude of people, and of the women who were mourning and lamenting, say that for me. Lamenting, thank you, lamenting him. But Jesus turning to them said, Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. Why would he say that? Again, he knows that in a few years from now, if you're pregnant and you're in Jerusalem in 70 AD, you don't want to be pregnant in Jerusalem in 70 AD. It's not going to be a good thing. That's what he's saying. And then it goes on a little bit further. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the woman who have never bore, that have never borne, and the breasts that have never nursed. Then they will say, begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, for the hills will cover us. For if they do these things in the green tree, what will they do to those in the dry? Well, the vision there between the green and the dry are the innocent and the guilty. So if they're going to do these things to innocent people, what are they going to do to the guilty people? Is it more horrible? And then we find this. And two others who were criminals being led away were led away, put to death with him. Now let's go over here to this. This is Antonia Fortress. I got my pen out here. This is where we're at. This is where everything took place here at the Antonia Fortress. Bob's not here. The Taylors had the opportunity to go to the Holy Sepulchre when they were in Jerusalem. And you would say, and they also went to the Garden Tomb, because everybody does that when you make a trip. And those are the two sites that they say that's where Jesus was buried, in the tomb. And they also say that's where the skull is, Golgotha, which is called the skull, right? They say that's up here at the Garden Tomb, and there's a face there that appears to look like a skull. And that kind of makes sense. And it's like when you're in Jerusalem, and the new walls are way around this way, going this direction, and you're saying, well, how could they be buried at the Holy Sepulchre? Because we're inside the walls of Jerusalem. Well, that wasn't inside the walls of Jerusalem back in that day. It was outside of the walls. You can see the walls right there. And when they left the town, you're talking about 2,000 feet or so that they supposedly walked through the Via della Rosa, which was going down and around these little streets. There's 14 stations in the Via della Rosa mentioned in the Bible, where they stopped and did this, they stopped and did this, and stopped and did this. Along that trip, 2,000 feet, which is a little bit over a quarter of a mile, before you would get to where Calvary is at. This would have been, again, if it was here, and Trent seems to think that's the case, by virtue of his studies, you take it as it is. At either point, either one of those were outside of the city. Either one of those had roads that went around them that people would walk. So the criminal who would have been there would have been carrying their sign to the vertical pole, and then they would put them on that vertical pole. They would nail it to the vertical pole. We know that in Isaiah, and we also know that in the book of Psalms 22, that it depicts this. And it says these things are going to occur, right? He's going to be nailed to the cross. He's going to be despised. He's going to be wounded, da-da-da-da-da. And the commentators say that they probably didn't put the nails in his hand. They probably put it in his wrist. Because when you put it in his wrist, he said it makes your hands crumble up like this. And you start losing feeling. And when they would put the nails in his feet, because his feet would have been bent, and they said, he may not have been lifted up high on the cross. We see this depiction of 3 crosses and one in the middle up a lot higher. And it's like, well, that may not have been the case. Because typically they said in the crucifixion, you could almost see the criminal eye to eye. Because this vertical cross was here, and they would just take him up there and they would nail him to it, which would be excruciating. I don't know if you've ever bumped into a telephone pole before, like with your shirt off or with your arm or something like that. Those things are pretty rough, you know. There's like splinters everywhere, and when you're put on a cross and you had just been beat, you had been whipped, you had been scourged with the whip and with the glass and the beads and the metal, and your back's all ripped up, and your blood's starting to dry a little bit, and you get put on that pole. I don't think that's going to feel very good. It's going to be excruciating. And that morning, you know, those Romans were like, hey man, what's on the agenda today? He goes, oh, we got a crucifixion. The centurion, we're going to talk about him in a minute. He says, well, how many do we need? Well, we got these two thieves. They're going to get hung on there. We got this other guy. His name's Barabbas. So we're just going to get 3 crosses ready. We just need 3 today. They did need 3 today. But Barabbas wasn't going to be on one of them. And it says, where did I leave that out? Verse 33. And when they came to the place called the Skull, where they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and one on the left. Let me get back to that, because we know that they say that some of them said Jesus was thirsty, right? So they put some
Vinegar.
huh?
Vinegar.
And they put it on a pole, and they says they gave it to him. Well, the commentator says maybe they didn't lift it up to him, maybe they lifted it over to him because, you know, he was in a horrible shape. They didn't want to be that close to him. I don't know. It could have been that he was elevated, could have been that he wasn't elevated, but the point is, he was on the cross, he was between 2 thieves, which was depicted in the Old Testament. He was between 2 sinners. The one who knew no sin was between 2 sinners. But Jesus is saying to them, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Still yet on the cross, Jesus has forgiven these people. And what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to love our enemies. We're supposed to forgive them. We're supposed to turn the other cheek. And the people stood by looking on them, even the rulers sneering at him, saying, he saved others, let him save himself. If he is the Christ of God, let him come down. The chosen one. He could have done that. He could have called 10,000 angels. You know? He could have looked at them and just did one of these bewitched things and go, and just zapped them. And he didn't do it. Right. Why? Because this is all predestined from the beginning of time. Jesus says, I came to fulfill the will of my Father. And, verse 36, and the soldiers mocked him, coming to him, offering him sour wine, and saying, if you're the King of Kings, save yourself. And there was a sign with an inscription above him, this is the King of the Jews. This was in Hebrew, or Aramaic at the time, Latin and Greek. Jesus, this is the King of the Jews. Who put that sign up there? Who mandated that? Pilate mandated it. So what did the Jews say? Get that sign down. He's not our king. And he said, look, what I've said is so. Here it is. Here's your king, guys. And one of the criminals who were hanged, they were hurling abuse at him. Now they actually both hurled abuse at him to begin with. We find that in the other Gospels. They both started out mocking Jesus, and then one of them changed his tune. That's what happens. We got, you know, our lives, we're filled with sin, we change our tune. And it says, verse 40, but the other answered, rebuking him, saying, do you not even fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? They knew that they were guilty of their crime. They were guilty of their crime of murder. And we are indeed justified, for we are receiving what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. One criminal has recognized that Jesus hadn't done anything wrong. And he was saying, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. So he's asking him to be saved. And what's it say? In verse 43, and he said to him, truly, truly, I say to you, today you shall be with me in paradise. That's pretty good. How long was Jesus on the cross?
6 hours.
6 hours. This thing started at like 9 o'clock in the morning. And it went all the way until 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're told in the scriptures somewhere, and the ninth hour would be 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And we're told in the scriptures that during the hours of noon until 3 p.m., what happened? Darkness fell upon it. Well, they were saying it was just an eclipse. We get eclipses all the time, do we not? But the scholars look back and they say it's absolutely impossible for an eclipse to happen at this time. Why? Huh?
It didn't last very long either.
3 hours.
No, the eclipse.
That's
The
pretty long.
regular eclipse doesn't last very long.
Eclipse didn't last. This lasted 3 hours. But you guess what? An eclipse can't happen. When it can't happen. I didn't know this. I'm not an astronomer, but I've looked it up.
When there's not a full moon.
When there's a full moon. And when is there a full moon? During Passover. Passover is always on a full moon. You can't have an eclipse. It can't be a coincidence. That's the point. It can't be a coincidence that there was an eclipse. And the eclipse don't last for 3 hours. Okay. Verse 44. And it was now about the 6th hour, and darkness fell upon the whole land until the 9th hour, and the sun became obscure, and the veil of the temple was torn in two. How was the veil torn? From top to bottom. Now, we know this thing was pretty tall. You know, if you didn't have a ladder, you couldn't get up there. So how could it be torn from top to bottom? It was torn from God's point of view down to man's point of view. And why was it torn? Now, there's no separation. Before, you had to have the high priest come and ask for forgiveness of your sins, and we talked this before, some religions think you still have to have somebody representing you. That's why the veil was torn. You don't need anybody else to represent you. You have the same right, the same freedom to go to God as the high priest did. And why? Because Jesus is the one who built the bridge between mankind and God. Because of him being on the cross, that thing's torn up, that veil's torn down, so that we have open communication to him. And it said the sun began being obscured, and the veil's torn. I already said that. Verse 46. And Jesus cried out with a loud voice, Father, into thy hands I've committed my spirit. And having said this, he gave up his last breath. Now, we know that he kind of rushes to the end here. Luke does. He doesn't go into all the things that all the other Gospels do. But we know that Jesus did say this. He gave up his last breath. We know that in the Garden of Gethsemane, when God created everything, he breathed the first breath of life into Adam from what? From the ground. He gave him the breath of life. We now know that the breath of life for us, for eternity, was given to us because Jesus gave up his last breath. And it says this, Pilate, now the centurion, this is verse 47. Now when the centurion saw what had happened, he began praising God, saying, certainly this man was innocent. This is the guy that was supposed to say, he was the chief guy there. He looked upon it. He probably saw, who knows, tens, maybe even hundreds of different crucifixions. I doubt he ever said, hey, this guy's actually the Son of God. This is what he's saying. We get this from a centurion. And the multitudes who came together for this spectacle, when they observed it had happened, they began returning, beating their breasts. They too came to that same kind of an assessment. These are the people that were around him. Now, here's a problem with the people around him. They were still wondering, well, is he going to raise from the grave? They didn't have any idea about this. They just thought they just lost their Savior. And all of his acquaintances and the women who accompanied him from Galilee were standing at a distance seeing these things. So then we go to this in verse 50. And behold, a man named Joseph, a member of the council, who was a good and righteous man. He had not consented to their plan of action. A man from Arimathea, Joseph of Arimathea, and the city of the Jews, who was waiting in the kingdom of God. This man went to Pilate and asked Pilate for Jesus. So we have Joseph asking for Jesus' body. This would have been a big, bold step. He's coming in to a Roman guy saying, hey, I'd like to get his body. Like, what the world's going on? And he took it down and he wrapped it in linen and he laid it in a tomb cut with uncut rock, a place that had never been used before, where no one had ever felt. We knew this from the Old Testament. Who was the other guy that helped him take it down? Nicodemus, Nick at night. Remember? You must be born again, Nick. This is who came and helped out. And it was preparation day for the Sabbath was about to begin. Remember when I told you we were over in Jerusalem and you guys were probably over there too? And I was ready for this big meal for breakfast on Saturday morning. And I go down with my big hunger. And do they have nothing but maybe like cereal? I'm like, where's everybody at? It's the Sabbath, bud. They don't come in till like noon. They have that Sabbath. They observe it. So the same thing here. They couldn't go to the tomb and do everything they wanted to do at the tomb because they had to observe Sabbath. So they did a quick job. put some oil and treatment, but they weren't finished with what they were going to do. And this is what they did. And they took it down, they wrapped him in cloth, and they laid him in a tomb of the uncut rock where no one had ever been laid before. And it was preparation day, for the Sabbath was about to begin, and the women who came with him out of Galilee followed after and saw the tomb and how his body was laid. So they were starting the preparation for the final burial of Jesus in this tomb. Now, whether it was in the garden tomb or the tomb at the Holy Sepulchre, it's irrelevant. There was a tomb in one of those two places that they laid Jesus. And we're going to find out next week the real story, because if we don't have next week, there's no reason for us to be here.
Right.
Because we wouldn't be serving a risen Savior. And we're going to find that out next week. Let's close in prayer. Dear God, again, I thank you for today. I thank you for your word, as always. And I pray that we will just have the desire, have the hunger and thirst to be in your word. And that you would just reveal to us some things that we perhaps didn't see before, or perhaps we need to know now. So that we can, grow with you, and more importantly, so that we can also share it with you, because that's what the command that you want us to do, to go and share. I pray that you'll just be with us now, guide us and protect us, and may we always lift up your name and be the light for you. In Jesus I pray. Amen.